In January 1961, over the quiet fields of eastern North Carolina, a U.S. Air Force bomber began to fall from the sky. The aircraft was a B-52 Stratofortress, one of the most powerful bombers ever built, designed to carry nuclear weapons halfway around the world. That night, it carried not one, but two Mark 39 thermonuclear bombs, each more than 250 times stronger than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Its mission was routine, a part of the United States Operation Chrome Dome, the Cold War's unrelenting airborne alert system. At the height of nuclear tension, American bombers patrolled the skies 24 hours a day, loaded with live atomic weapons, ready to strike if the Soviet Union launched an attack. The crew of this flight belonged to the Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in Goldsboro, North Carolina. They were seasoned, disciplined, and accustomed to the monotonous rhythm of long-range patrols. Their route that night was standard: climb over the East Coast, refuel mid-air, and maintain airborne readiness before returning to base. The weather was cold but clear, a typical winter evening in the American South. Below, farmhouses glowed dimly across Wayne County. Children slept. The world turned quietly, unaware that above them a nuclear weapon was flying in circles. At approximately 10:30 p.m., the B-52 rendezvoused with a KC-135 tanker for in-flight refueling near the town of Goldsboro. It was a maneuver performed countless times before, but that night something went wrong. Fuel began to pour uncontrollably from the right wing. The boom operator in the tanker noticed the leak first, a stream of fuel glistening in the moonlight. He radioed the B-52 immediately. "Your right wing's streaming fuel. You're losing it fast." The pilot, Major Walter Tulloch, checked his gauges. The readings confirmed it. The bomber was losing thousands of pounds of fuel per minute. The aircraft's right wing was compromised. They broke off refueling and turned toward home, but the leak worsened. Within minutes, the situation escalated from concerning to catastrophic. As the bomber lost fuel, the balance of the aircraft shifted. The right wing began to sag under the stress of the heavy load. Alarms screamed through the cockpit. At 10:57 p.m., Major Tulloch made the call no pilot ever wants to make. Crew prepared to bail out. Below them, the fields of North Carolina stretched dark and silent, a patchwork of farmland, creeks, and small towns. No one there knew that in a few minutes, pieces of an atomic bomber would rain down upon them. The B-52 began to disintegrate mid-air. At 11 p.m., the bomber's right wing sheared off entirely. A sudden burst of wind and pressure tore through the fuselage. Debris and fuel scattered across the night sky. For the crew, there was no time to think, only to act. 8 men were aboard that night. As the aircraft began to spin uncontrollably, Major Tulloch ordered the crew to eject. One by one, they leapt into the cold night air. Some parachutes opened, others did not. 3 crewmen perished. 5 survived. Witnesses on the ground, farmers and townsfolk from the nearby community of Faro, described seeing a fireball in the sky, followed by 2 large parachutes drifting down in eerie silence. When emergency teams arrived at the crash site hours later, they found the wreckage scattered across miles of farmland. One piece of the fuselage burned furiously in a swamp. Another had smashed into a muddy field, but it wasn't the wreckage that terrified them, it was what came with it. Somewhere among the debris were 2 nuclear bombs, fully armed and possibly active. The men who first approached the site had no idea what they were standing near. One local, a farmer named Clyde Davis, described seeing a large metallic object half buried in the mud. It was still smoking, and a parachute was tangled nearby. He thought it was part of the airplane. It wasn't. It was a hydrogen bomb. By dawn, the U.S. Air Force had sealed off a 10-square-mile area. Trucks, jeeps, and military police surrounded the fields near Faro. Soldiers in protective gear arrived. Helicopters circled overhead. No official explanation was given to the locals. They were told only that a military aircraft had crashed and that debris recovery was underway. But rumors spread quickly. Within hours, word leaked that the crash involved atomic weapons. The Air Force called in explosive ordnance disposal teams, the only men trained to approach nuclear bombs. They arrived from Washington and nearby bases, armed with Geiger counters, classified manuals, and an unspoken understanding that one wrong move could end everything. The first bomb was easy to locate. It had descended slowly under its parachute and come to rest upright in a field. Amazingly, it appeared largely intact. Its tail fins were twisted, but the casing was unbroken. Technicians moved cautiously. Inside, the weapon was a series of arming mechanisms, switches and sensors designed to ensure that the bomb would only detonate under very specific conditions, such as freefall from a bomber with all safety locks disengaged. But when investigators opened the arming panel, they froze. Of the bomb's 6 safety devices, 5 had failed during the breakup. Only one small switch, a single low-voltage trigger, had prevented the bomb from detonating. Had that final switch been set differently, the state of North Carolina might have ceased to exist. The Mark 39 thermonuclear bomb was designed to produce a blast yield of 3.8 megatons, enough to annihilate everything within an 8-mile radius and spread lethal fallout for hundreds of miles. If it had detonated, the explosion would have vaporized the town of Goldsboro, destroyed nearby cities such as Raleigh and Fayetteville, and blanketed the East Coast in radioactive ash. The fallout could have reached Washington, D.C. At the crash site, technicians worked in silence. They slowly removed the bomb's high explosive component, then disconnected the triggering system. Every movement was deliberate. One spark, one jolt could have been catastrophic. Meanwhile, the second bomb was still missing. Search teams combed the countryside, scanning with radiation detectors and digging through mud. Eventually, they located the parachute canopy tangled in trees near the Nahunta swamp. The bomb had slammed into the ground at nearly 700 miles per hour. It buried itself deep in the mud, so deep that only a few pieces of the tail were visible. Crews began excavating immediately. They dug by hand, then by machine. After days of digging, they reached 20 feet, then 30, but the main nuclear core was gone. It had sunk further into the swamp, into layers of soft earth that no equipment could safely penetrate. Eventually, the Air Force made a grim decision. They would leave part of the bomb buried. They removed the secondary components, but the uranium core was entombed in the ground, sealed beneath concrete and guarded by military personnel for years afterward. To this day, part of that bomb remains buried under North Carolina soil. When the sun rose over Wayne County the morning after the crash, the full scale of what had happened began to unfold. Military convoys filled the roads. Local police were ordered to block all access points, and hundreds of Air Force personnel spread across the farmland. The scene looked like an invasion, and in a way it was. The United States had invaded its own soil, searching for its own lost nuclear weapons. Residents stood at a distance, watching soldiers move through frozen fields and swamp mud. Many still didn't know what had crashed. They only knew the government wanted them far away. Rumors swirled. Some said a spy plane had gone down. Others whispered that a nuclear thing had fallen from the sky. A few brave locals, ignoring the cordons, went out to see for themselves. One farmer years later recalled standing near a metallic cylinder half buried in the earth. It was about 12 feet long, smooth with strange markings. He said, "They told us to leave fast." Within 48 hours, the Air Force had set up floodlights and tents. Bulldozers dug trenches, while scientists from the Atomic Energy Commission arrived with radiation sensors. The media was given a brief statement, a routine training accident, no mention of nuclear weapons. Inside a makeshift command post, officials debated how much to reveal. Only a handful of them understood how close the nation had come to disaster. At the center of the operation, Lieutenant Jack Revell, the explosive ordnance disposal officer, oversaw the disarming process. He and his men spent days carefully extracting the bomb components. Years later, Revell would recall a chilling realization. When I saw how many of the safety devices had failed, I remember thinking, if I'd been standing there and it had gone off, I wouldn't have known it. He was right. Had the final switch triggered, the bomb's fireball would have reached tens of thousands of feet into the air. The heat at ground zero would have been several times hotter than the sun's surface. The farmland outside Goldsboro would have become a crater, and the radioactive fallout carried by the jet stream would have poisoned much of the eastern United States. But that didn't happen. One tiny switch, a 28-volt low-voltage trigger, had saved millions. The technicians recovered the first bomb entirely and transported it to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base under heavy guard. The second remained partially underground, unreachable. The Air Force encased the area in concrete, installed groundwater monitors, and quietly left. For the people of North Carolina, life returned to normal. The fields were replanted. The rumors faded. The military never admitted how close the nation had come to annihilation. But those who had been there never forgot. For decades, the incident remained classified. Officially, it was referred to as a broken arrow, the U.S. military term for an accident involving nuclear weapons that does not result in a nuclear detonation. Between 1950 and 1980, there were more than 30 such incidents, but none were as close to catastrophe as the Goldsboro event. In public, the Pentagon insisted that safety systems had worked as designed. There was no chance, officials said, that the bomb could have detonated. Privately, internal memos told a different story. Documents later declassified revealed that 5 of the 6 interlocking safety devices had failed. The last remaining switch, called the arm/safe mechanism, was the only barrier between America and nuclear disaster. In 1961, that information was buried under classification orders marked Secret Restricted Data. Even members of Congress were not briefed on how close the country had come to losing an entire state. For years, journalists and historians tried to uncover the truth. Requests under the Freedom of Information Act were denied. Officials refused to answer questions. The Air Force continued to maintain that the weapon was not capable of nuclear yield. But evidence kept leaking. In the early 1980s, a researcher named Parker Jones, who had worked on nuclear weapons design, wrote a memo for the Sandia National Laboratories, the facility responsible for weapons safety systems. His report was blunt. He titled it, "How I Learned to Mistrust the H-Bomb." Jones revealed that, contrary to official statements, the Goldsboro bomb had come within a hair's breadth of detonation. His chilling conclusion read, "One simple low-voltage switch stood between the United States and a major catastrophe." The memo remained classified for years, but when it was finally released, it confirmed what many had long suspected. The Air Force had come seconds away from detonating a nuclear weapon on its own soil. In 2013, more than 50 years after the incident, new documents were released to the public following a Freedom of Information request by The Guardian. The files contained previously unseen technical diagrams and internal communications between the Air Force, the Atomic Energy Commission, and the Department of Defense. They revealed that the bomb's parachute system had functioned correctly, that its trigger circuits had armed, and that the only thing preventing detonation was a manual safety switch that had not yet flipped to arm. Had the aircraft's breakup been slightly different, had a wire connected, a voltage surge occurred, or a switch toggled, the bomb would have exploded. One nuclear engineer reviewing the files stated flatly, "If the Goldsboro bomb had detonated, it would have been the worst nuclear disaster in history. The loss of life would have dwarfed Hiroshima." The declassified documents also revealed a second chilling detail. For years after the crash, the buried components of the second bomb were monitored for radiation leakage. To this day, small traces of uranium remain beneath the surface. Local authorities assure residents the area is safe, but few forget that deep below the farmland lies a weapon meant for war. The Goldsboro incident came at a critical time in American politics. The Cold War had escalated sharply after the U-2 spy plane crisis of 1960, and both superpowers were racing to build bigger and more numerous nuclear arsenals. President John F. Kennedy had taken office just days before the accident. He was briefed on the event in private and was reportedly shaken. Yet the administration decided not to disclose the details publicly, fearing it would damage confidence in the nation's nuclear deterrent. At the same time, the U.S. military continued Operation Chrome Dome, flying armed bombers around the world every day for years afterward. Between 1961 and 1968, at least 8 accidents occurred involving B-52s carrying nuclear weapons. Each was handled in silence. Each could have ended civilization as we know it. The Air Force insisted that the risks were justified. Keeping bombers airborne ensured America could strike back even if the Soviet Union launched a surprise attack. It was the logic of mutual destruction, and it nearly destroyed America itself. For the crew of the doomed bomber, the story never really ended. Major Walter Tulloch, the pilot, was hailed for keeping control of the aircraft long enough for most of his men to eject. Co-pilot Captain Richard Harden died when his parachute failed to open. 2 other airmen, Sergeant Francis Barnish and Sergeant Eugene Shelton, also perished. Their families were told only that their loved ones were lost in a training accident. The true nature of their mission remained classified for decades. The survivors, haunted by what they had carried, rarely spoke about it. One crewman later said quietly, "We were trained to think of the bombs as just equipment, but that night, when the plane broke apart, I realized what was really falling with us." For the residents of Goldsboro and Faro, the memory lingers too. Older locals still recall the sirens, the soldiers, and the whispers that followed. Some still refer to the field outside Faro as the bomb field. To this day, the site is marked only by a small roadside sign placed in 2012, understated, almost forgotten. Nuclear mishap, January 24, 1961. Beneath that quiet patch of earth, history still sleeps, fused metal, sealed concrete, and the weight of what almost happened. The Goldsboro incident forced quiet reforms within America's nuclear program. Engineers redesigned arming circuits, adding multiple fail-safes and independent safety locks. Procedures for airborne alerts were tightened. By the late 1960s, the era of nuclear bombers on constant patrol began to fade. Missiles, not aircraft, became the backbone of deterrence, but the fear remained. The event became a reminder that even the most advanced technology is only as reliable as the people who build and operate it, and that no system, no matter how carefully engineered, is ever truly safe from failure. In 2013, after the release of the final declassified report, a journalist asked a retired nuclear engineer how close America had come. He paused for a moment and said, "Close enough that you wouldn't be sitting here if it had gone the other way. Imagine for a moment that the switch had failed, that in the quiet hours of that January night, a light flickered from safe to arm. A blinding flash would have illuminated the Carolina sky. The shockwave would have reached 50 miles in every direction. Cities would have burned. The East Coast would have been poisoned by fallout, and history, as we know it, would have been rewritten. Instead, the bomb that fell on North Carolina became a warning, a reminder that the greatest threat to civilization is not always the enemy abroad, but the mistakes within. For decades, the fields of Wayne County have remained calm, green, and silent. But buried deep in the soil is a relic of that night, sealed, forgotten, and humming faintly with the ghosts of history. In the archives of the Pentagon, one file carries the words, "Broken Arrow, Goldsboro, North Carolina, January 24, 1961. For those who read it, one line stands out above all others. 2 weapons were involved, one device fully armed. That is the story of the bomb that fell on North Carolina, the day America almost destroyed itself.